Congressman Ritchie Torres says Republicans are robbing tens of millions of Americans of their fighting chance at a decent life. He's referring to the GOP's plan to gut Medicaid. At least $880 billion is reportedly on the chopping block, potentially leaving the 71 million Americans enrolled without benefits. Cuts to the social safety net program are personal for Torres. He represents New York's 15th district, which includes South Bronx. 67% of its residents are on Medicaid. So according to the census, Medicaid provides medical care for low-income populations and people with disabilities. Large cuts to the program stand to impact his constituents the most.
Congressman Ritchie Torres joins us now to discuss. Welcome to Rising. Thanks so much for being here, Congressman.
An honor to be here.
So let's get right into it. Republicans say their view is, well, look, we're just going to change the eligibility requirements so that if you're an able-bodied young person, you have to be working or seeking work in order to get these benefits. How would you respond to that?
Well, first, Republicans are effectively defunding health care and food in the tune of over $1 trillion in order to pay for tax cuts for the top 1%, which to me is, A, fiscally irresponsible at a time when interest on the debt has surpassed $1 trillion a year. We're spending more on debt than we are on defense or Medicare or Medicaid. But also, it's morally wrong. I mean, no district has a greater stake in Medicaid than mine. More than 70% of children, more than 80% of nursing home residents, more than 90% of baby deliveries in my district are covered by Medicaid. And take work requirements. Work requirements in theory are paperwork requirements in practice. Right? The evidence tells us that work requirements do not lead to greater employment. It simply causes people to lose their health care. Arkansas was the first state to implement a work requirements program. It caused 18,000 people to lose their health insurance in the first 5 months, and the vast majority of those people were eligible for Medicaid. So the point of these frequent eligibility checks or these so-called work requirements is actually to cause people to lose their health insurance.
What do you say to people that are constantly bringing up the fact that there's a rampant abuse of fraud? Is that accurate? What's your response to them?
Look, there is fraud and waste and abuse in every program, including Medicaid, but it's nowhere near the $715 billion cut that Republicans are envisioning for Medicaid. So in 2023, the improper payment rate was about 5%, $30 billion. Of the $30 billion, 80% was attributable to insufficient documentation or administrative errors. So the actual amount of fraud is small in the grand scheme of the overall program.
Look, I hear what you're saying about creating extra paperwork for, government bureaucrats to check on people if they're meeting the eligibility requirements. I hate making everything less efficient and making things more costly. So I do hear you on that. But then what do we do at the end of the day if we have massive debt? And this bill, which I've criticized, will add to the debt. I understand that. I'm not a big fan of that.
Massively.
Massive additions to the debt. But we have to cut. I don't support, massively raising taxes in order to cover our debt. We have to find something to cut. Maybe that's what Elon Musk was trying to do. I don't know how well it worked out. Where can we find some savings to help get the debt under control?
Look, instead of pursuing a hyper-partisan reconciliation bill that's going to grow the deficit by $3 trillion, and if it's made permanent, by $5 trillion, and we're on a trajectory to have interest on the debt surpass $2 trillion in the 2030s. That's going to be the result of the Republican reconciliation bill. Instead of pursuing that course, why not negotiate a bipartisan compromise that seeks to make these programs more efficient, that raises taxes on the top 1%, because we are planting the seeds of a fiscal crisis. I worry about the future of our country. If a superpower were planting the seeds of its own decline, it would paralyze the global economy with uncertainty. It would erode confidence in the the dollar, the world's reserve currency. It would allow its manufacturing base to atrophy from neglect. It would grow the deficit until it becomes the largest budget item in our federal budget. That's not a story of success. That's a story of national decline.
Now, 64 Republicans represent districts that have higher than average Medicaid rates. So what do you think is the disconnect? I don't think that Republicans are actually trying to commit political suicide by doing this bill. So what do you think?
Well, Trump keeps forbidding them to do any
So why do you think this is even still on the table, that we're cutting so much from?
The Republican Party is not the party of working people. It's the party of the top 1%. Keep in mind that healthcare is 20% of our economy. So 20% of our economy depends heavily on funding from Medicaid. And so what is at stake is not only the lives of the people who receive Medicaid. What is at stake is the livelihoods of people who are employed by health care providers dependent on Medicaid. It is often the case In most rural and urban counties in America, the largest employer is the healthcare provider. The largest employer in the Bronx is the Montefiore Health System.
Democrats right now, they lost the 2024 election.
Yep.
They're suffering I would say, I think even many Democrats would admit, a kind of crisis of confidence of the American people, have lost confidence in them, particularly with all these revelations coming out about Joe Biden's own health and who knew what, when, and where. You're a rising leader of the party. What is your strategy for restoring the party's faith from the American people's standpoint?
I feel like it's simple. We should ask ourselves, what are the issues that matter most to voters, and then campaign on those issues. And it seems to be if we campaign on a platform of lower cost, lower crime rates, more secure borders, that is a vision that appeals to the vast majority of Americans.
What do you think that, piggybacking off of that, what do you think that Democrats maybe have gotten wrong or from the feedback? Because I do think it's an opportunity to keep being articles about what can happen in the midterms and how the Democrats can take Congress back. What do you think that tactic is to get to that goal?
Well, look, I'm confident that we are well positioned to win back the House in the midterm elections. But I feel like we have to be careful. We cannot simply stand against Donald Trump. We have to stand for something. We have to put forward an affirmative agenda that inspires the American people. In the 1990s, Newt Gingrich had the contract with America. Maybe we should have our own contract with America. If Donald Trump had Project 2025, we should have Project 2029. We should be a party of ideas.
I hear you on that, but again, the amount of money we are spending on healthcare in this country, even comparing to peer nations, we spend so much more than they do for, I would say, questionably better care. Maybe it's not even better care. We have a mix of a government system and a private system. Obviously, the Democrats under Barack Obama really prioritized trying to change the healthcare system in some way. I think that whether that worked out or not is probably highly debatable and is an ideological question. But the savings have to come from somewhere, because the young people are paying into an entitlement system that they're not going to get benefits out of when they're older. And young people, they can't buy houses, they can't start families, they can't do all sorts of things because we are frankly paying for the boomer generation that set these policies this way. And I know that's a lot of voters, and you got to promise them that, well, we're not touching your Medicare, we're not touching your benefits, we're not doing anything of that nature. But to my mind, that is going to lead us down a slippery slope of continuing to support a failing system for young people.
Look, I agree. The affordability crisis, the crippling cost of housing and healthcare and higher education is crushing the next generation of Americans. But the Republican reconciliation bill will make housing and higher education and healthcare more scarce and unaffordable to the next generation. So it will achieve the opposite of what you hope for young Americans.
And I think there's a disconnect between how many people can actually die from losing this health care. There's people who are actually on the line, their lives depend on this and don't have any other way. So what would you tell people if you're making them break down with your district having such a high enrollment, what that means for some of the Americans that are looking towards this coverage?
I have a constituent, Jose Hernandez, who had a spinal injury that left him paralyzed. And he said to me he would not be alive were it not for his home care worker, who was funded by Medicaid. His mother died from cancer. His home care worker became his only family, and it enabled him to put himself through college and become an advocate for those with disabilities. I spoke to a constituent, Phyllis Lombardi, who has a son with severe autism, and she had to spend all of her retirement funds in order to get her son the care he needed. And when he was finally eligible for Medicaid, it was a game changer. And I said, how much would it have cost you in the absence of Medicaid? She said $16,000 a month. I am not aware of a working person in this country who can afford $16,000 a month for autism care. So this is not about dollars and cents. This is about lives and livelihoods.
Representative Torres, thank you so much for joining us on Rising. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Next up, Marco Rubio and Tim Kaine really got into a heated altercation over the South African refugees. We'll discuss more Rising right after this.